Hey, Naomi.
Hey, Amie. Great to see you.
Good. How are you?
I'm great. Especially great because I'm sitting here with this very nice Sierra
I
Nevada view.
know. Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to Outdoor State of Mind. I hope you guys are ready for a good chat. Maybe grabbed a cool one to join with us. Tonight's episode is sponsored by Sierra Nevada, and we thank them for not only sponsoring the show, but being partners to POW, and they have been dedicated to sustainable operations since the 80s when they were founded, and I've always just admired them for that. So cheers, everybody. And then, of course, Naomi Oreskes, thank you so much for joining us. Cheers to you.
Cheers.
And how are you? How are things?
I'm great. Fine. Working hard.
And so for everybody tuning in, if you can just kind of tell us a little bit about you and your relationship with POW.
Well, I'm a house geek. I'm an academic. I teach the history of science at Harvard University. Before that, I was a geologist, but I've always spent a lot of time outdoors. Nature, the outdoors is my first love. I got interested in science and geology because I just love the earth. I love being outside. It was one of the few academic disciplines where you could spend a lot of time outdoors. And that commitment to the outdoors, outdoor life, led me into the climate change issue and then connected me up with POW. And I've been working on this issue for almost 20 years now.
Yeah, and so you're a POW board member, correct? And,
correct.
So obviously you know about the outdoor state, and so it sounds like you're a part of the outdoor state in many ways, but you're an avid skier, and of course I'm a professional skier, so seems like you and I don't have much in common on paper, but I hear you love to come out and ski in Utah.
I do. We've been skiing at Alta for about 20 years now. We've been going to Alta every winter, and then as often as we can. We always go at Christmas, try to go back in February, March. Last year I spent the whole month of February on the mountain, which was like the best month of my whole life. So
yeah, you nailed it. Well,
really
we'll have to make sure we link up on the slopes at some point. I hear you got to ski with Caroline this year, so I'm next. And then of course I got to meet you last year in Washington D.C. last September. And that was my first time meeting you and hearing you speak in person.
Yeah, and that's a big part of what I do and how this issue connects for me. So I'm a scientist and a historian of science by training. I come to this issue through the science, through the scientific understanding of the planet and climate and the ways in which our activities are damaging the climate and therefore damaging us and the snowfields and all the things we love and care about. But one of the things I've come to understand in the last 10 years is that as much as this got framed initially as a scientific issue, and as much as we look to scientists to give us good, high-quality information about what this issue really is and why it matters, ultimately, it is political. It's about policy. It's about who's making the decisions and how we, up until now, have been kind of disempowered. And so going to Washington, D.C. with POW, being part of those lobby days, and being part of this initiative, it's all about finding our voice, making our voice heard, and speaking up, because as the outdoor state of mind is all about, we're as big as the biggest state in America. We are a lot of people. We have a lot of voices, but up until now, our voices have not really been heard, not the way they need to be. And so that's what this is all about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that actually that trip to DC, I've been involved with POW for a long time as kind of like a sideline character, just because I'm part of the Tahoe community and I know Jeremy. But then I went to DC last fall, and that really completely shifted and ramped up my kind of involvement and my just willingness to even speak up and use my voice. And a lot of that was, the information available through POW, but then also once I started diving down that, listening to you speak, starting to go down all the many podcasts that you've been a part of, and listening and reading your work. And I think that, all of a sudden, I lacked confidence before. I was kind of didn't know if I was political, or didn't know if I, had the credibility to speak up for these things. And the more I learn, the more I realize that I totally do. And there's so much we can do and say. And, I think I'm really excited to interview you, because you were a big part of me kind of listening to you on the Drilled podcast was one of the really big changers for me. And I started to learn about all the stuff we're going to talk about. So I suppose we can just jump right in. And my first question.
Let me just say something about that before you go to your first question. Sorry about that phone ringing just there. It's impossible to close out life completely. But but I think what you just said is super important, right? Because here you said you lack confidence about speaking in public, but I mean, here he is, you're a professional skier. You do all kinds of unbelievable things that leave the rest of us awestruck, right? I get up in public and I talk, and to me, it's like no big deal, and other people are awestruck. And so there's a lesson in that, right? That we all have our talents, our strengths, or what POW we like to call our superpowers. And it's easy to discount that and say, oh, I can't do that. But I mean, think about the incredible things you do in your work. And just taking even a small piece of that into your public voice is so powerful. And what we've seen over and over and over again is that the athletes have so much credibility. I mean, when we went to Washington and the athletes started talking, Tommy Caldwell and, Carolyn Gleick, and when Jeremy speaks, I mean, the senators, they're just starstruck. You can hear a pin drop in those rooms. And I've been to a lot of hearings, and I can tell you, I have never seen senators pay attention the way they paid attention when our athletes were talking in DC last year. So it's a reminder to all of us that we often have a lot more capacity than we give ourselves credit for. And when we dig down, being an athlete is all about digging in, right? When we dig in, whatever the challenge is, we often find that we not only can do it, but often we crush it. And that's what this is all about. It's about crushing it on so many different levels.
And I think that's like the point of the outdoor state, right? Because those, whether you're a professional or just a recreational outdoor lover, a lot of whatever you learn through those sports that you love, I think can totally be applied to kind of taking on climate change and maybe becoming more political. And I think, a lot of my skills as a professional athlete totally have transferred over into like this new challenge I've brought into my life. But I think that goes the same for everybody that's part of the outdoors. So.
Absolutely. I mean, what is skiing, rock climbing, hiking, whatever it is you do? I mean, it's all about that moment when you look at something, you think, bloody hell, I can't do this. Anyway. And then you do it, and then you are really happy that you did it, and you never ever regret it later. Like, when did you ever ski a slope or climb a cliff or summit a mountain and afterwards think, oh, I really regret that I did that? No, never, right? You're always so glad that you stuck with it, that you put one foot in front of the other, and that you finished the job, right? And that's how we're going to feel when we get this climate change thing nailed too. It's going to be tough. It's going to hurt. And there's going to be a lot of times along the way that we're going to be tempted to give up. But when we finally get there, we're going to be so glad that we did.
Absolutely. Okay, now I'm going to go to my first question. And that's, you're a professor of history of science at Harvard. So I guess just start with basically sharing with us the role of science in our society and how science is actually implemented in our day-to-day lives.
Well, science is crucial for us understanding the world we live in. If we don't understand the world we live in, then we're kind of left powerless to do anything about it. And so climate science has been essential for us in understanding that the things we do make a difference, that when we burn fossil fuels, whether it's in generating electricity or driving a car or flying in an airplane, we're putting garbage, pollution, carbon pollution into the atmosphere, and that has consequences. Like everything we do in our lives has consequences. The food we eat, affects our performance. So the pollution we put into the atmosphere changes the climate. And if it weren't for science, we wouldn't know that. So we need science as a baseline to understand what this problem is. We also need it in our everyday lives because, and right now we are witnesses to what happens when you ignore science. Because scientists were telling us back in January that COVID-19, that the coronavirus, this was a novel coronavirus, that people did not have immunity to it, and that if we didn't act very quickly, we would be looking at large numbers of deaths. And of course, that is exactly what happened. The scientists totally predicted this. And we are seeing, literally 100,000 people have now died in the United States from this disease. I won't say that all of those deaths could have been prevented, but if we compare what has happened in the United States to, say, New Zealand or South Korea, we know that many of those deaths could have been avoided had we paid better attention to what the scientists were saying. So it tells us that this isn't just an abstract concept. This isn't something that's just for geeks and eggheads. This is something that affects all of our lives every single day.
Right, absolutely. And whether or not you don't have to be a scientist to listen to and believe scientists, which I think it's always weird that science is something to believe in or not. It's science. There's a whole process. And so I guess with that in mind, how in a way where science is such an important part in our lives and is basically everywhere in certain ways. Can you explain kind of how we're in this situation where it's become really hard to filter out the truth and the noise and the disinformation, and how it does seem really hard to just manage all that?
Well, it is hard, and we're in this situation for a reason. It's not just bad luck. Unfortunately and sadly, there have been people who have been deliberately trying to muddy the waters, deliberately try to confuse us about the science. This was the subject of the book I wrote with Eric Conway, Merchants of Doubt. We made it into a film. And what we discovered in our work, we were trying to understand why would anyone reject the scientific evidence of climate change? Like, you could understand that we might disagree about the solutions. That's totally reasonable. And reasonable people could disagree about the best approach to solving this problem. But how could reasonable people deny the facts, the scientific evidence? I mean, the planet is warming up. We've measured it. We see it. This isn't some theory. These are facts. These are observable facts. So why would anyone deny that? And so we set out to try to answer that question. And what we found was a very sad story, a very disheartening story about the deliberate promotion of disinformation and denial by corporate actors and certain kinds of ideologically driven think tanks, mostly funded by the fossil fuel industry, although not entirely, but mostly funded by the fossil fuel industry, who were deliberately trying to create confusion on the issue so that we wouldn't act. And so we would just keep on using fossil fuels, and they could keep on making profits, and they could be laughing all the way to the bank while the rest of us were picking up the bill.
Yeah, I mean, this information, what you just said there, when I found that out, that was one of the key turning points in my mind in terms of my passion and dedication to use what voice I have for this cause. And so, going with your book, Merchants of Doubt, and the film, obviously maybe there's financial reasons, but what are some of the incentives and the reasons that these companies were doing this, and what have been the outcomes basically that we've seen from that kind of directed misinformation, created misinformation?
Well, there's three big reasons they do it. The first one is obvious. The fossil fuel companies do it for money. I mean, this is the most profitable industry in the history of mankind. They make huge amounts of money. They have tremendous amounts of political control, which they use to protect their vested interests. And so they do not want us using fewer fossil fuels. They do not want us shifting to a clean, green, renewable economy. So that part of the story is pretty obvious and not exactly surprising. The more subtle part of the story had to do with political ideology. And again, this is where, politics is messy, and a lot of us would rather say, oh, I don't want to get involved with politics. But the reality is we're in it whether we like it or not. And if we don't acknowledge it, then we won't be able to fix it. So what we found was that the fossil fuel industry had made common cause with a set of libertarian think tanks that promote free market solutions to social problems, like the Cato Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And of course, market-based solutions work for many things. Markets are very effective at many things. Capitalism has been good at delivering a lot of goods and services and a high level of prosperity to many people, but there's this kind of Achilles heel of modern capitalism, which is the problem that economists call external costs, or I just call paying the bill, right? The true cost of living, the true cost of activity. So when we burn fossil fuels, it creates carbon pollution, and that does damage. And the fossil fuel companies don't pay for that, right? So that damage just spread out to everyone. You could think of it as capitalism for the corporate sector and socialism for us picking up the bills, right? And so these ideologically oriented think tanks, they may have started out with a rational or reasonable argument, but it became irrational over time. It became a kind of ideological blinder, a kind of religious faith in markets, that they would defend markets no matter what and oppose regulation on principle, even when it was clear that that principle was essential to protect people's health and safety. And so the fossil fuel industry and these ideologically driven think tanks made common cause. And that combination of deep pockets, a lot of money, billions of dollars spent on lobbying, advertisements, disinformation, with ideological fervor, that has proved extremely powerful. And what we've seen over the last 30 years is that every time there's been some kind of move in Congress to pass a meaningful bill to address climate change, or on the state level, like the Washington initiative last year to have put a price on carbon pollution, every time there's been something like that, this coalition has joined forces to try to block it. And so it's not surprising that we've been stuck politically on this issue, because we have this incredibly powerful coalition working to block action. You know, in the film, we interviewed this fellow who was a chief of staff to James Inhofe, who had been involved in climate change now for a really long time. And, you know, he said just totally openly, he goes, yeah, well, you know, in a way, what we do is easy. We're just trying to stop stuff. We're not trying to actually achieve anything. We're just trying to throw a spanner in the works. So we have the easy job. You guys have the hard job. And that sadly turns out to be true, which means we have to acknowledge and say, yeah, this is tough. We've got an uphill battle against very powerful forces. But I think in a way it's a bit of a David and Goliath story, because yes, the fossil fuel industry is Goliath, but there's a whole lot more of us. There's 50 million Davids against their one Goliath. And that's the grounds for hope here and optimism that we can change things. We can make a difference. We did it with tobacco, and we can do it with fossil fuels.
Well, and you guys have also uncovered that a lot of the people, a lot of these players in these organizations that are putting up these, you know, roadblocks, it's actually a very small group of people that was working with the tobacco industry and that has worked with the chemical industry. And it's not, oh, there's all these people out here doing this. Like when you watch the film, you see the same faces over and over again, basically pretending to be experts or scientists, but it's like a small group of people. Am I right?
Exactly. And that was one of the things we discovered that we thought was empowering, that they would like you to believe that they are the majority. But in fact, not only are they the minority, they're an incredibly small number of people. So in our book, we were able to trace this story back to actually 4 people, which at first people didn't even believe us. They're like, how is that even possible? And I was like, well, you know, when good things happen, we take it for granted that a small number of good people can make good things happen. So why would we not believe that a small number of bad people can make bad things happen? But we were able to show through the documents, through the historical record, that actually this relatively small group of people, but when they were funded and supported then by what became a large network, had really had a huge negative impact. And the other key thing we found, as you mentioned, is that they had worked with the tobacco industry. And in fact, they had learned the strategy of doubt mongering, of spreading disinformation, confusion, doubt about climate science. They had learned that working with the tobacco industry. Now, many of the people listening are probably too young to remember this, but for the old folks here, we remember the days when the tobacco industry had advertisements on television telling us that smoking was good for you, that more doctors smoked Camels, that Luckies were toasted, and implying that somehow that made it okay. And the tobacco industry spent hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe more, on misleading advertisement, disinformation, designed to make the American people think that smoking wasn't really bad for you, or that we didn't really know, even when in fact the scientific evidence of its harms was overwhelming. And they delayed action on tobacco control for decades, and millions of people died because of what they did. And what we were able to show in our book was that it was the same people who started climate change denial.
Yeah, when I learned this, I was so frustrated and flabbergasted and all these things. But then at some point, it also was a positive shift in that I kind of realized a lot of like the self-guilt I was putting on myself and a lot of the hypocrisy that I was putting on myself and that a lot of my peers were actually was in a way planted by the fossil fuel industry to make me feel inadequate to actually mobilize and do anything about it. And the point is that's just not the case. Nobody's going to be perfect on this thing. And we are going to, it's not, you don't have to snap your fingers and change your life. You know, we just have to raise our voices as, you know, that number we keep saying, the outdoor state, the 50 million people is powerful. So I think we're going to show a quick teaser of your film. And then after that, we have, I think, an audience question for you.
Great.
You guys should go watch that. You can. It's fascinating. I after watching it, I kind of like just wanted to punch something, but then I also, at the same time, it's like so frustrating, but then so inspiring at the same time. So, the question for you, Naomi, from the audience is: do you think that climate change denialism is on its last days compared to what it was even 5 years ago?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. All of the support that and support that. I think we know that lying. Oh, sorry, I'm getting a lot of feedback. Jake, I don't know if you can adjust the sound or something, but
Sounds better now.
Oh, okay, thanks. Yeah, no, we definitely know that that's the case. Now, however, we also know that when people are on their last, they sometimes get kind of desperate. So I think we also have to expect that they're not going to go gently into that good night. They're going to fight back, and some of the things they do will probably get even uglier than they've been. I think we have to be prepared for that. And it's like you just said a few minutes ago, Amy, but what we need to know is that this is not our fault. So if you speak up and you get attacked, which you may well do, it's really important for you to know it's not because you did anything wrong. In fact, it's probably the opposite. It's probably because you did something right. You were probably effective and persuasive, and so they thought, oh, this person is persuasive. We have to do something to stop that.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, I think this whole journey has been about that kind of dichotomy of like being really frustrated, being really discouraged, but then being really inspired and seeing hope. So kind of taking it to the right now, being that obviously we're all aware that we're in the midst of a global pandemic. And from a climate standpoint, yes, maybe there's some moments of hope and emissions are likely down quite a bit, maybe 8%, cleaner air, cleaner water, et cetera. And we have seen, people take large-scale action across the globe to take on this problem. So talk about, I guess what I want to know from you is what are the similarities between how we are handling COVID-19 and climate change?
Well, I think COVID-19, there's a lot of lessons here, some good, some bad. The bad one is that we see what happens when we ignore scientific evidence and advice. So as I already mentioned, the unwillingness to pay attention to scientific evidence early on the part of the Trump administration and other leaders made this problem much worse than it needed to be. And that's something that we need to hold on to and remember. Sometimes people say the problem with getting people mobilized about climate change is that it's very abstract and the consequences seem to be far off in the future. Well, here we had a case where it was not abstract and where the consequences were not far away. They were right here, right now. And so now we see what it looks like when we don't pay attention to scientific evidence. And so climate change is just like COVID-19, except it's kind of slow motion. And so in our own minds, what we need to do to think and to explain to people is to say, COVID-19 is climate change on fast forward. So now imagine slowing this down, but people will still die and people will get hurt and the economy will be damaged. And we have to make that case. The good news is how much people have stepped up to the plate on this issue. And the amazing thing, I've been incredibly encouraged and gratified by what the public opinion polls show, because they show that the vast majority of the American people, something like 70 to 80%, do believe the scientific experts, do respect what the scientific experts are saying. The vast majority of us have stayed home, and we have not been forced to. There's been no police at our doors, but we've stayed home because we recognized it was the right thing to do, both for our own safety and the safety of others around us. We've recognized that we are actually all in this together, and that what I do does affect people in Michigan and Florida and California and Utah and Idaho, and that it's not just a matter of me acting as an individual, that what I do affects us all and vice versa. And that recognition, I think, is really actually extremely deep. I think it's really profound. And again, public opinion polls show the majority of the American people do not want to reopen the economy too quickly. The majority of the American people have said protecting people's health and safety is more important than the economy, although I think that's also a false dichotomy. And the other really big important issue, I think that I'd like everyone today to take home if they can, environmental problems are often posed as a dichotomy between the economy on one side and environmental protection on the other. And we've seen this framework being used in COVID-19. We have to stop staying home because we have to get the economy moving again. Well, COVID-19 has proven once and for all that that is a false dichotomy. It's a big lie. And we've known it for a long time because we have a million academic studies that show that when you protect the environment, it generates jobs, and often they're better, cleaner jobs, like jobs in tourism and hospitality and skiing are a whole lot nicer jobs than jobs in mining and oil and gas extraction. Mining and oil and gas are extremely boom and bust economies, whereas green jobs typically are more sustainable, not just environmentally, but also economically. But here in the COVID-19 crisis, we ignored scientific data. And what happened? People got sick, people got hurt, people died, and we wrecked the economy to boot. We did not protect the economy by ignoring the scientific evidence. In fact, the opposite. The countries that paid attention to the scientific evidence saved lives and saved their economies. And so this is the proof that we've been needing for a long time, that that is a false dichotomy. And if we hear anyone say it, we have to immediately say, that's a false dichotomy. Going forward, we're going to rebuild this economy on a green footing. It's going to generate jobs. It's going to make people healthier, safer, cleaner, happier, and richer.
Right. And that was, again, talking about my journey of aha moments, is when you learn more about the projections for the economy moving forward in renewables versus where we are right now. It is good for the economy to move on and find new ways of dealing with all these things. But I think the similarity I see between the COVID-19 pandemic and what we face with climate change is that these issues aren't science issues, they're not health issues, they're not environmental issues, they're humanity issues. And that humanity is what's being affected. And that includes our economy, but that includes people's lives, people you love, your kids, generations to come. And so, that's, if you care about humanity, then you need to care about obviously protecting yourself against COVID-19, but also climate change. So that to me has been like kind of this big unifying moment, and it is so encouraging to see that when you're faced with something, people are rising to the occasion.
Absolutely.
But climate change might be further away and more distant, but we still need to also rise to that occasion.
Right. And now that we've done it for this, it's a reminder that we can do it again, right? It's, again, getting back to those sports metaphors, right? The first time you ski your first double black diamond slope, well, I don't know. I was kind of old when I did it. So maybe it's different if you're young, if you grow up skiing, which I did not. But, the first time you do it, you think, bloody hell. And the second time you think, okay, I've done this. I can do it again, right? And by the third time, you don't even think about it. Just off you go, right? And it's fun.
But I think fear is like a weird thing in all this, right? Because I think a lot of where people's resistance comes from is fear of changing. Like fear of change is a normal thing to be scared of, but fear of changing your way of life and fear of losing your way of life. And, yes, you might have to change small bits of your life, but if you do nothing when it comes to climate change or the pandemic, you're going to have to change your life drastically at some point. And it's going to be as a reaction to a disaster, which isn't what we want. But as a skier, I deal with fear all the time, and I learn how to manage it and move forward and move past it and all these things. And so I think that, one thing that humans are is naturally courageous. And so I think, like, again, taking this courage that you learn in the mountains and applying it to these other things, I think is a takeaway that our beautiful community can have.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, it's natural to feel fear, and it's a good thing, right? A certain amount of healthy fear is good. You don't want to be reckless and stupid and do something idiotic, right? But at the same time, you can also channel that fear and say, yeah, I get it, change can be scary, and we know that it is, and that people fear change even when it's for the better. But knowing that, you can say, yes, but I know that on the other side of this change, there's something that actually is better, not just for the planet, but also for me, and vice versa, right? It's going to be better for me as an individual, and it's going to be better for all of us, as you say, for humanity at large.
Right, absolutely. So we're getting a bunch of questions from our viewers, and we'll start with one for you, Naomi, and it's, why don't we treat climate change like a pandemic in the way we buy less, use less, and make better use of what we have?
That's a great question. I think it relates to what I said a few moments ago about the sense of urgency, because climate change is abstract, and because it's not always easy to see the direct connection between how we live and how we behave and how we drive our cars and whatever else it is we do, and the impacts of climate change. It can be sometimes difficult to make that connection and therefore feel a sense of urgency. And the potential tragedy of climate change is that by the time it becomes so obvious, so clear, then it's too late to fix. And so this is the big challenge, is to mobilize people to act now to prevent a big disaster later. So COVID-19 in that sense is different, but if we can kind of make that connection and point out, well, look, when we knew that the threat was immediate, we did act. So what we have to do with climate change is just to recognize, okay, it's not quite as immediate, but it's awfully immediate, because a lot of things that were far away 30 years ago I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Jim Hansen testified in Congress in 1988, and I can remember my professors in graduate school thinking that he was exaggerating the threat or saying, well, it's far off in the future. Well, it might have been far off in the future in 1988. It is not far off in the future now. The climate is changing around the globe. Storms have become worse. Droughts have become worse. Crop failures are occurring, and we know that these things are being made worse by climate change. The science is there. So we are no longer talking about the future. We are talking about the here and now. But again, making that connection, it is more difficult, and that's part of the work that we have to do.
I also think there's something to be said about the fact that, like, of course, adjusting our lifestyles to be less consumption oriented is really important. However, this isn't an issue that we're going to change by individually never using a plastic straw again, or individually buying an electric car. As great as that might be, it's a whole system wide thing that needs to change, so that we, nobody's asking anybody to take their lives back to the Stone Age. Like, I think that life can still go forward, and we can change our lifestyles without losing all these comforts of modern life that we're very well accustomed to. So as much as stay home, buy less, use less, okay, it's more than that. Like, you on your own aren't going to solve this. That's why we need everybody in this community to come together and make that voice louder than these few voices that keep blocking the road.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a lot of things we can do as individuals, and by all means, we should do those things if we can, because everyone should do what they can. We all need to do our part at home. And many of those changes are good for us, like eating less meat is good for climate change, and it's also good for your personal health. Other changes don't involve any sacrifice at all. So, I mean, again, part of the big lie is that we have to sacrifice, we have to suffer, you're going to freeze in the dark, you're going to be miserable. Well, here's my lamp, right? This light is coming 100% from solar photovoltaic electricity, from solar panels on my roof. And guess what? If I hadn't told you that, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference, because it's just as bright and just as good and cheaper than the electricity I used to get from fossil fuels. So there's an awful lot we can do that does not involve sacrifice, that actually makes our lives as good or better than they were before. But as you said, there's also a limit to how much we can do as individuals. I like to say I can change my light bulbs, but I can't change my electricity grid. And that's where we all have to work together to fix the parts of the problem that we can't solve on our own.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, this is another listener question. It looks like it's for me. The question is, it's super difficult for me to actually talk about these issues without sounding like a massive know-it-all or just shoving facts down people's throats. Does anyone have anything they've found that works for them when talking to people about climate change? I am curious. I think, the way I'd answer that question is, a lot of times where I start and where POW has really shown us, the roadmap to kind of connecting with people is you start with things you have in common. And almost everyone I come across, I can usually find a commonality and some sort of love for the outdoors. And that's usually kind of the unifying factor of, like, maybe this person comes from a totally different walk of life than me. Maybe they've never skied, but they enjoy hunting, or they enjoy going fishing at their local lake, or they enjoy hiking or spending time in the park. And I think that when you make it more about kind of those shared passions, that's a good place to start. And I think that also embracing the fact that we're not perfect. No one's perfect. And that doesn't mean you're a hypocrite. Like, that's a huge stepping stone that I've had to kind of come over, and that, like, it's not realistic for me to purchase an electric car right now, like, as much as I'd like to, and I still do drive and fly places, but not letting those imperfections hold you back, and then kind of bringing the conversation always back around to, like, what are we, we're standing for our playgrounds together, what do we have in common, what do we love together? And so again, going back to the fact that, like, you and I don't have a lot in common, but we both love to ski, so we got that.
Right. I think I agree with that completely, and the thing I would add to it has to do with asking them a question. So if you're engaged in a conversation with someone, it means there's something that's on their mind. There's some reason that they're even having this conversation with you in the first place. There's something they want to know. There's something that's troubling them, something that's bothering them. And so you can ask them that question. You could say, well, what part of this issue are you confused about? Or what's on your mind? What would you like to know? And if I find that if you switch it that way, I mean, and this probably especially works for me, because as a Harvard professor, people expect me to be a know-it-all. And so if I don't do that and don't fulfill their stereotypes, but instead say, well, what is it about it you aren't sure about? Then it kind of empowers them to be honest, and also to not be embarrassed. Say, well, you know, I'm confused. And I have a great story I like to tell about this. When my daughter was in middle school, her teacher showed a film in class that was a climate change propaganda film that she had received, that had been sent to her by one of those think tanks that we featured in the film that you just saw the clip of. And my daughter got really upset because she knew, because of my work, that it was a propaganda film. And so she went up to the teacher and said, you know, this is a propaganda film. And so the teacher invited her the next day to do a presentation on climate change. So imagine, you're 13 years old, you're in 8th grade, and now suddenly you have to explain to your class what climate change is. So to her huge credit, she did this, and it was great. And her friends were all extremely impressed. But that night we went out to dinner. We're sitting in a restaurant, and she says to me, Mom, how do we know that it's not caused by the sun? And I just thought that was a great moment, right? Because totally legitimate question, you know? And so it was one of those restaurants with paper tablecloths. So I started drawing a little sketch with the troposphere and the stratosphere and solar radiation and the greenhouse gas effect. And as I'm explaining it to my 13-year-old daughter, I noticed that the people at the table next to us and behind us are leaning in to listen.
That's awesome. That's so cool. I mean, I don't know. I think there's a lot of different ways you can approach it, but I guess we're definitely a little over our time, which I probably knew was going to happen. But I guess let's wrap up with one last question, and that kind of bringing us all back together is, you know, when we are presented with information, how do we figure out if it's reliable information, and how do we find out if what science we're being told or what facts we're being told? What are some good ways we can figure out what's real and what's not?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And the first simple question is just to say, who is this person, right? You saw Mark Morano in the film saying, you know, we're just the negative force. So you ask yourself, well, who is this guy? And then you find out he's a political operative. So that should be a red flag. He's a political operative, and he's telling you not to believe science. So, you know, the first thing is, if a person's talking about science, are they a scientist? Do they represent a scientific organization? Do they teach at a university or work in a national laboratory? Now, if it's a policy debate, that's different. Mark Morano has a right to his opinions on policy, but what he doesn't have a right to do is to misrepresent the scientific information. The other thing you can do is to go to websites of groups like POW that have links to scientific sources on climate change. NASA has a great website that my co-author Eric Conway helped to produce, which has good facts about climate change. There's also the website Skeptical Science that has simple answers to the 10 most common skeptical questions. So there are some good resources out there. And I think once you know that disinformation is a thing, you very quickly begin to recognize it. The patterns are pretty obvious. So at the risk of shameless plug, I think if you watch the film or read my book, after that, you won't be fooled again. In fact, that's kind of what we say at the end of the film, right? Fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, shame on you. Fool me 17 times, we're talking about disinformation.
Right. And that's been basically my experience, is that once I've kind of learned what's really going on behind the curtain here, then it's been a lot easier to tell what's real, what's not real, and how to go and back that up. But speaking of, you know, everybody, thank you guys. We're past our times. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Thank you for all your questions. If we missed any, we will try to get them to you another way through fancy technology these days. And Naomi, thank you so much for being here with us and being part of Protect Our Winters. And yes, you guys, please do go watch and or read Merchants of Doubt. It's key information into changing your perspective on this whole situation. And for me, it gave me a lot of confidence. So I hope it does the same for you. Also, make sure you tune in on Thursday for the next Outdoor State of Mind series. It's going to be David Weiss, who is an Olympic gold medalist, and he's going to be speaking with Matt Siegel, who's a professional rock climber. And they're going to be talking about how to make your voice heard when it comes to advocacy. So I'm sure that's going to be awesome. Again, thank you to our sponsor, Sierra Nevada. Cheers. Nothing like a Tuesday evening cold beer. Cheers to all you guys. Cheers to everybody that's part of this awesome outdoor state. Thank you guys for tuning in. Please reach out to POW with questions, and keep the voice up. And thank you so much, Naomi.
Oh, thank you. It's been great to be here with you. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Cheers, guys.